What if I told you that your brain lies to you every day, and that this isn't a defect but part of your mind's normal functioning? Before you think this is absurd, stop for a moment and think, how many times have you been absolutely certain of something and then discovered you were wrong? How many times have you fully trusted what you saw, felt, or remembered, and yet reality showed you something else? If this has ever happened to you, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may deeply surprise you. From the moment you wake up until the moment you fall asleep, your brain is interpreting the world, filtering information, filling in gaps, and creating a version of reality that seems solid, coherent, and reliable. But this feeling of certainty is often an illusion. The truth is that the human brain wasn't designed to show reality as it is. It was designed to ensure survival, speed, and energy efficiency. And for that, lying can be extremely efficient. Perhaps you've never stopped to question this, but everything you perceive, what you see, hear, feel, and remember, passes through a highly selective and often distorted system. The brain decides what is important, what can be ignored, and even what needs to be invented for the experience to make sense. Have you ever experienced this? That feeling of having seen something out of the corner of your eye that simply wasn't there, or of being certain that someone said something that, in fact, was never said? These small errors are not isolated flaws. They are part of a much larger pattern. Within the universe of scientific curiosities and the mysteries of the human body, few phenomena are as unsettling as realizing that the brain, the very structure we rely on to make decisions, interpret dangers, and construct our identity, can be an unreliable storyteller. It creates mental shortcuts, distorts information, and constructs internal narratives that seem absolutely true, even when they are not. And the most intriguing thing, most of the time you don't even realize you're being deceived. The brain lies because it needs to process a gigantic volume of information all the time. Being completely accurate would consume too much energy and take too much time. So it simplifies, generalizes, and fills in gaps based on past experiences, emotions, and expectations. This is how illusions, false memories, misinterpretations, and even decisions that seem rational but actually stem from unconscious impulses arise. What you feel as reality is often an extremely convincing simulation created within your own mind. And this doesn't only happen in extreme or rare situations. It happens now as you watch this video. It happens when you remember your childhood, when you interpret someone else's intentions, or when you feel fear without knowing exactly why. The brain creates a comfortable, logical, and continuous narrative because the chaos of pure reality would be too difficult to bear. The problem is that, in doing so, it also hides truths, alters facts, and reinforces beliefs that don't always correspond to what is really happening. Perhaps the most unsettling question is, if your brain lies to you every day, to what extent can you trust your own thoughts? This question, far from being negative, is precisely the gateway to understanding some of the strangest phenomena of the human mind. Stay with me until the end of this content because as we progress, these lies begin to reveal a pattern, and understanding this pattern completely changes how you see yourself and the world around you. Now, before moving on, keep this idea in mind. What you call reality may simply be the best version your brain has been able to construct at that moment. And from here, things start to get even more interesting. And perhaps that's exactly why this subject affects us so much. Because, on some level, everyone has felt that silent discomfort of realizing that something within their own mind wasn't as aligned with reality as it seemed. That memory you swore was true, that absolute certainty that later crumbled, that intense emotion that arose without warning and led you to act in a way you couldn't even explain. If, while listening to this, any personal experience came to mind, share in the comments what touched you the most so far. Sometimes putting it into words helps to see more clearly how the brain influences, and often distorts, what we feel and believe. If this topic resonates with you, if these reflections are sparking curiosity or even a certain unease, please like this video. This simple gesture shows that this type of content matters, that investigating the mysteries of the human brain is worthwhile and deserves to continue being explored. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who also wonder why their own minds sometimes seem to work against them. Subscribing to the channel is also a way of saying, I want to understand more. I want to continue exploring these strange phenomena of the brain and the human body. Each subscription strengthens this community of curious, restless people willing to question what has always been taken for granted. Here, the idea is not to offer easy answers, but to provoke new questions, the kind that linger in your mind long after the video ends. And from that point on, when we begin to accept that the brain isn't exactly a mirror of reality, something changes. Because if it lies, there's a reason. And when you understand that reason, you start to see patterns that previously seemed invisible. That's precisely where the journey becomes deeper. and that's what we'll explore next. When we start observing all this more closely, an inevitable question arises almost automatically. If the brain lies, does it do so maliciously? The answer is more uncomfortable and, at the same time, more liberating than it seems. The brain doesn't lie because it wants to deceive you. It lies because it's not interested in the truth. Its main objective has never been to reveal reality as it is, but to keep you alive, functional, and moving. Absolute, raw, and detailed truth is simply not a priority for an organ that evolved under constant pressure, in hostile environments, where thinking fast was more important than thinking correctly. The human brain is, first and foremost, an energy manager. It functions like someone who needs to make thousands of decisions every day with limited resources. Every second, an absurd amount of stimuli tries to enter. Sounds, images, bodily sensations, memories, emotions, random thoughts. Processing all of this with maximum precision would be too expensive. So the brain does what any intelligent system would do to survive. It creates shortcuts. These mental shortcuts are efficient, fast, and economical, but they come at an invisible price. They distort, simplify, and often invent. This is where the great revelation lies. The brain doesn't want to know what is true, it wants to know what is useful. It prefers a quick answer that works well enough, to a perfect answer that arrives too late. This logic shapes your mindset, influences your decisions, and constructs an internal narrative that seems coherent, even when it's full of gaps. The feeling of certainty you experience doesn't come from truth, it comes from familiarity. The brain confuses what is repeated with what is real. Think about how many times you've made important decisions based on impressions, intuitions, or vague feelings, and only later constructed arguments to justify what you'd already decided. This isn't a lack of intelligence. It's the brain operating exactly as it was programmed to operate. It acts first, explains later. It creates internal narratives that protect your identity, preserve your sense of control, and avoid internal conflicts. Questioning these narratives too much requires energy, and the brain doesn't like to expend energy unnecessarily. Behind the scenes of the mind, there's a silent mechanism working constantly to reduce complexity. It takes a chaotic reality and transforms it into something simple enough to be bearable. The problem is that, in this process, much is lost. Details are ignored, nuances disappear, and uncomfortable truths are softened or completely hidden. What reaches your consciousness is already edited, filtered, and organized according to what the brain believes to be safest at that moment. This dynamic has a profound impact on how you see yourself. The identity you believe you have is, to a large extent, a narrative created and maintained by the brain to continue your personal story. Abrupt changes, internal contradictions, or information that threatens this narrative are often rejected, minimized, or reinterpreted. Not because you are deliberately running away from the truth, but because the brain understands that stability is more important than accuracy. Keeping everything in place seems safer than allowing an internal transformation that generates discomfort. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we understand that the brain works this way, we begin to see patterns that previously went unnoticed. Anxiety without apparent cause, disproportionate fears, hasty judgments, inflexible certainties. All of this can be seen as a direct consequence of this system of shortcuts. The brain prefers to err along with the majority than to be right alone. It prefers to repeat an old belief rather than expose itself to uncertainty. It prefers a simple explanation, even a false one, rather than face the void of not knowing. This affects relationships, career choices, financial decisions, and even how you interpret your own past. Memory, for example, doesn't serve to record facts, but to guide future behaviors. It is shaped according to your current needs. The brain adjusts memories to reinforce learning, justify choices, and protect self-esteem. The historical truth of events matters less than the emotional impact these memories have on you now. There's something almost poetic about all of this. The human mind isn't a cold machine searching for truth, but a living, adaptable system deeply interested in continuity. Every distortion has a function. Every false narrative has a hidden purpose. The problem arises when we begin to confuse these internal constructs with absolute reality, without realizing that we are looking at the world through an old filter, created for a context that may no longer exist. When you understand this, your relationship with your own thoughts begins to change. Instead of automatically accepting them, a space for observation emerges. A slight distancing that allows you to realize that not everything that goes through your mind deserves to be treated as fact. This is the beginning of a silent journey of transformation, where questioning doesn't mean losing control, but gaining awareness of the inner workings of your own mind. And the more you observe, the more you realize that these lies follow a predictable logic. They appear at the same times in response to the same triggers, always trying to keep everything running smoothly. Recognizing this doesn't eliminate the distortions, but it completely changes the impact they have on you. From here, what seemed confusing begins to take shape, and certain revelations start to make sense in an almost disconcerting way. If all of this resonated with you, comment at the end of this video writing, "This makes sense to me." When we accept that the brain doesn't seek truth, but efficiency, it becomes easier to understand something even more unsettling. What you call seeing isn't exactly what's happening out there. Seeing seems automatic, almost mechanical, as if the eyes were a faithful camera capturing reality in real time. But this feeling of precision is one of the most well-constructed lies of the human mind. The brain doesn't see the world. It reconstructs the world from fragments, assumptions, and past experiences, creating a version coherent enough for you to move forward without freezing. What reaches your eyes is only a small amount of raw information. The rest is filled in internally. The brain takes incomplete signals of light, color, and movement and transforms them into objects, faces, depth, and meaning. It does this so quickly that the illusion of continuity becomes almost perfect. You feel like you're seeing everything when in reality you're only seeing what it considers relevant. The rest is discarded or invented. And the most impressive thing is that you don't even realize this process is happening. There is a literal blind spot in your eyes, a space where there is no visual input whatsoever. Even so, you don't see a hole in your vision. The brain simply fills in this void based on what is around it. It decides what should be there and moves on. This happens all the time, not only with the physical blind spot, but with information gaps scattered throughout perception. The reality you experience is a continuous collage, carefully adjusted to appear stable. Visual illusions are not curious tricks or mind games. They are direct proof of how the brain prefers coherence to precision. Lines that appear crooked, colors that change depending on the context, movements that don't exist, faces where there is nothing but shadows. These phenomena reveal the inner workings of perception. They show that the brain doesn't ask what is really there, but rather what makes the most sense here. And sense in this case doesn't mean hidden truth but utility. This constant reconstruction has a profound impact on how you move through the world. It influences quick judgments, first impressions, and seemingly obvious decisions. You believe you are reacting to what you see, when in reality you are reacting to what the brain has anticipated. Expectation comes before observation. The brain uses past experiences to predict the present. When the prediction is good enough, it doesn't even bother to check the details. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this logic isn't limited to vision. It extends to how you interpret situations, people, and even yourself. The brain creates an internal scenario based on probabilities. If something seems familiar, it assumes it's safe. If something deviates from the norm, it triggers alerts even without concrete evidence. This is how many fears, prejudices, and absolute certainties are born. Perception is not neutral. It's shaped by your journey, your mindset, and the stories you've told yourself over time. When you enter a familiar environment, the brain automatically fills in what it doesn't see based on memory. This saves energy and speeds up decisions. But it also creates room for errors. Subtle changes go unnoticed. Important details are ignored. The mind acts as if it's saying, "I already know what this is." And this false sense of control creates comfort, but it also limits the perception of the transformation happening right before your eyes. This dynamic helps explain why two people can experience the same situation and perceive completely different realities. Each brain reconstructs the world through its own filters. Emotions, beliefs, experiences, and expectations function like invisible lenses. What is a threat to one person is an opportunity to another. What seems obvious to one person is confusing to another. Not because one is right and the other wrong, but because they are seeing different versions of the same scene. There is something profoundly human in this process. The mind prefers stability to surprise. It seeks patterns even where none exist. When it finds something incomplete, it fills in the gaps. When it finds something ambiguous, it decides quickly. This behavior has had an enormous impact on the survival of our species. But in today's world, full of artificial stimuli, screens, fragmented information, and constant pressures, these shortcuts can generate even greater distortions. The feeling of "I saw it with my own eyes" carries enormous authority. Questioning it seems almost like a betrayal of one's own conscience. But understanding that vision is a construct changes how you relate to your certainties. A space of curiosity emerges. A silent invitation to observe more carefully, to doubt more gently, and to recognize that what seems obvious may only be the most comfortable version that the brain has managed to assemble at that moment. When you start to notice this, small revelations appear in everyday life. Situations that previously seemed clear gain new layers. Automatic reactions begin to be seen as conditioned responses. Perception ceases to be a mirror and becomes a map, useful but imperfect. And the more you observe this map, the more you realize that it omits paths, exaggerates dangers, and softens contradictions to keep everything running smoothly. This awareness is not meant to generate constant distrust, but to broaden your perspective. To understand that seeing is not capturing reality but interpreting it. And this interpretation, however convincing it may be, always carries invisible choices made by the brain in the name of efficiency. From this point on, when you question what you see, you are not distancing yourself from reality, but approaching the mechanisms that shape it within you. If this idea made you look at what you call real differently, comment below. I'm on this journey too. When we understand that visual perception is a construct, another pillar that seems solid begins to wobble in an even more disconcerting way: memory. There is an almost universal belief that remembering is accessing a file stored somewhere in the mind, as if the past were intact, waiting to be revisited at any moment. But this is one of the deepest illusions the brain creates. Your past is not a file. It is a living narrative, constantly transforming, being rewritten every time you believe you are merely remembering. The brain doesn't store experiences like a camera records videos. It stores loose fragments, sensations, emotions, vague images, meanings. When you try to access a memory, what happens isn't a faithful reproduction of what occurred, but a reconstruction based on these scattered pieces. The brain fills in the gaps using what you feel today, what you believe today, and who you are at this moment in your journey. The result seems real, coherent, and familiar, and that's precisely why you trust it. Every time you remember something, that memory becomes malleable. It leaves its stored state and enters circulation again. In this process, small changes occur. Details are adjusted, emotions are intensified or softened, characters take on new roles. When the memory is saved, again it is no longer the same. It's an updated version aligned with your present mindset. The brain lies to you about your own past, and you believe it because the story makes sense. This has a profound impact on how you construct your identity. Who you believe yourself to be today is, to a large extent, a result of the stories you tell yourself about yesterday. The brain organizes the past in a way that maintains a continuous, logical, and emotionally bearable narrative. Contradictions are minimized. Failures are justified. Confusing moments receive explanations that may never have existed. Not out of malice but out of necessity. The mind needs coherence to move forward. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we look at memory this way, many certainties begin to unravel. That clear recollection of an important conversation, for example, may be mixed with emotions that arose much later. The tone of voice you swear you heard may never have been exactly like that. The intention you attribute to someone may have been created by your mind to close a story that was left open. The brain prefers a complete version, even if inaccurate, to dealing with uncertainty. This mechanism influences current decisions without you realizing it. Past experiences shape future choices, but if those experiences have been distorted over time, the decisions that arise from them also carry those distortions. Memory isn't just for remembering, it serves to guide behavior. It's a survival tool, not a repository of hidden truth. The impact of this appears in relationships, missed opportunities, persistent fears, and recurring patterns. There's something almost revelatory about realizing that two people can have completely different memories of the same event. Each brain reconstructs the story according to its own emotional needs. It's not about who is consciously lying, but about how each mind has organized the background of that experience. The factual truth is lost, but the emotional truth remains, and, for the brain, that's what matters. This dynamic also explains why some memories seem more real than others, even when they aren't. Intense emotions strengthen the feeling of certainty, not accuracy. The stronger the feeling associated with the memory, the more true it seems. The brain confuses emotional intensity with historical accuracy. And so, internal stories gain the status of absolute facts, shaping attitudes, judgments, and even how you see the future. When you realize this, a different inner space begins to emerge. A place where you can observe your own memories with more curiosity and less rigidity. Instead of asking, "Did it happen exactly like this?" another question arises, more useful and more honest: "Why did my brain choose to store it this way?" This change of perspective doesn't erase the past, but it transforms the relationship you have with it. Memory ceases to be a sentence and becomes an imperfect map, full of shortcuts and omissions. This awareness opens doors to a silent transformation. You begin to notice how certain stories repeat themselves within your mind, how some episodes are revisited always in the same way, reinforcing old emotions. At the same time, you realize how many alternative versions could exist for the same events. The brain chose one because it was functional at that moment. But that doesn't mean it's the only possible one, nor that it needs to remain the dominant one. The more you observe this process, the more evident it becomes that the past is not something fixed. It adapts to the present. It responds to your current mindset, your beliefs, your fears, and your desires. This can be frightening at first glance, but also profoundly liberating. If memories are reconstructions, there is room to reinterpret, reframe, and even soften truths that previously seemed immutable. Not erasing what happened but changing the impact it has on you today. And it is precisely at this point that the mind begins to reveal something even more intriguing. If the brain is capable of altering the past within you, what does it do with the emotions that arise in the present? If memories are shaped afterward, what comes first? The feeling or the explanation? This question doesn't appear by chance, because as we move forward, it becomes increasingly clear that the mind constructs stories not only about what has already happened, but also about what you feel now. If all of this resonated with you, comment by writing, "This makes sense to me." When we reach this point in the journey, a fundamental piece begins to fall into place in an almost disconcerting way. Emotions don't arise after rational analysis, they come before. Long before. The feeling you have that you think, evaluate, and then decide is, most of the time, an elegant construct created by the brain to maintain a sense of control. In practice, the process usually happens in reverse. First you feel. Then, the brain rushes to create a story that explains why that feeling makes sense. Emotions function as rapid, automatic, and extremely powerful signals. They arise without asking permission, based on old patterns, reconstructed memories, expectations, and past experiences. When an emotion appears, the body has already reacted before you can even formulate a conscious thought. The heart races, the stomach contracts, the muscles tense. Only then does the mind come into play, trying to organize everything into acceptable words, reasons, and justifications. The brain hates a vacuum of explanation. It can't stand the idea of feeling something without a clear reason. So it creates a narrative. A logical, coherent, and often socially acceptable story. This story isn't born to reveal the hidden truth of what happened, but to alleviate the discomfort of not understanding one's own reaction. Reason becomes an elegant spokesperson for decisions already made in the emotional backstage. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where many people begin to recognize themselves. Think about how many times you've been involved in a relationship that, from the beginning, seemed wrong on some level. Something didn't fit but you still went ahead. Then over time explanations emerged. I thought the person would change, I didn't want to be alone, at that moment it seemed like the best choice. These justifications came later. The emotional decision had already been made long before any rational argument. The same thing happens with impulse purchases. You see something, feel desire, excitement, or the promise of emotional relief. The purchase happens. Only later do explanations emerge. I deserve it, it was on sale, it will be useful. The brain creates a narrative to protect the self-image of someone rational and conscious. Admitting that emotion was the deciding factor threatens this identity, so the mind reorganizes the story to make everything seem logical. Wrong decisions follow this same invisible script. When something goes wrong, the brain revisits the past and adjusts the narrative to explain why that choice seemed right at the time. It softens ignored warnings, minimizes doubts, and reinforces the points that support the decision. Not because you are deliberately deceiving yourself, but because the brain understands that blaming yourself too much or confronting the raw error can generate emotional instability. And once again, stability comes before truth. This mechanism has a profound impact on mindset. It creates the illusion that we are more rational than we actually are. Reason comes to be seen as the leader, when in reality it often acts as a press officer for emotions. It organizes the discourse, chooses the right words, and constructs a narrative that makes sense to you and to others. Meanwhile, emotions continue to operate behind the scenes, silent and decisive. This dynamic explains why discussions are rarely resolved with logic alone. Two people can present impeccable arguments and still leave frustrated. Because the real conflict lies not in the arguments, but in the feelings that preceded them. Fear, insecurity, the need for recognition, the desire to belong. Reason attempts to give form to all of this, but rarely manages to touch the emotional root that originated the problem. When you start to notice this pattern, something changes in the way you observe yourself. Instead of asking yourself, what was the right decision, a more honest question arises: what was I feeling when I chose this? This simple shift opens up space for important revelations. You begin to see how certain choices repeat themselves, how certain emotional triggers always lead to the same paths, even when logic suggests different alternatives. The brain creates stories afterward because it needs to maintain a sense of internal coherence. Living in constant emotional contradiction would be exhausting. So it adjusts the narrative so that everything seems to be part of the same continuous line. This ability was essential for human survival, but in the modern world it can generate confusion, regret, and patterns that are difficult to break. Upon closer observation, you begin to notice the impact of this process on sensitive areas of life. Careers that no longer make sense, yet continue to be defended with rational arguments. Strained relationships maintained by well-told stories. Dreams postponed because fear was justified as prudence. In all these cases, emotion drove the decision and reason merely followed the script. This awareness is not meant to devalue reason, but to put it in its proper place. Reason is a powerful tool, but it is not the origin of everything. When you recognize this, you begin to deal with your own emotions with more curiosity and less judgment. Instead of trying to silence them, you begin to listen to them, understanding that they carry important information about unmet needs, limits, and desires. And that's precisely where the journey gets even more interesting. Because if emotions come first and stories come later, an inevitable question arises. What happens when the brain uses fear as the primary raw material for these narratives? What changes when the dominant emotion is not desire, but threat? This transition happens so subtly that it is rarely noticed, but its impact is profound and constant in daily life. If this passage made you recognize yourself in any choice or situation, comment by writing, "This makes sense to me." When fear enters the scene, the brain reveals one of its most persistent and impactful lies. Unlike other emotions, fear doesn't need solid proof to take control. It arises from subtle signals, quick interpretations, and often from dangers that don't actually exist. Yet the reaction is real. The body responds as if it were facing a concrete threat, even when everything happens only in the realm of thoughts. The brain was shaped to detect risks even before fully understanding what is happening. Throughout evolution, ignoring a potential danger could be fatal. Therefore, it learned to err on the side of caution. It's better to sound the alarm unnecessarily than to remain silent in the face of something truly dangerous. This mechanism made sense in an unpredictable and hostile world, but in today's daily life it creates a constant feeling of alert, as if something is always about to go wrong. This is how anxiety, catastrophic thoughts, and that hard-to-explain restlessness arise. You're not in danger, but your body acts as if you were. Your heart races, your breathing changes, your mind starts projecting future scenarios full of losses, rejections, or failures. The brain isn't analyzing facts, it's responding to possibilities. And, for it, possibilities are enough to justify an intense reaction. This manufactured fear infiltrates even the simplest decisions. An unanswered message becomes a sign of rejection. A small mistake transforms into proof of incompetence. Silence becomes a threat. The brain constructs stories based on fragments, fills in gaps with negative hypotheses, and presents all of this as intuition. The feeling is one of certainty, even when there is no evidence whatsoever to support that conclusion. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where many people recognize themselves without realizing it. How many times have you stopped yourself from trying something because you imagined everything that could go wrong? How many opportunities have been postponed because your brain presented such a frightening scenario that it seemed safer not to act? Fear didn't need to prove anything. It only suggested possibilities and the mind did the rest. This logic affects relationships, career choices, and even how you see yourself. The brain prefers to keep you in familiar territory, even if uncomfortable, rather than risk the unknown. It confuses familiarity with safety. New situations trigger automatic alerts not because they are dangerous but because they deviate from the norm. The hidden truth is that often fear is not protecting you from something real, but protecting the brain from the effort of adapting. Behind the scenes of the mind, fear acts like a harsh editor. It selects information, highlights risks, and ignores safety signals. When something goes right, the brain quickly minimizes it. When something seems uncertain, it amplifies it. This imbalance creates the feeling that the world is more threatening than it actually is. And the more times this narrative is repeated, the truer it seems. The impact of this on daily life is profound. People spend years trapped by decisions made to avoid risks that never existed. Dreams are adjusted to fit within fear. Relationships are shaped by the anticipation of abandonment. The brain constructs an entire journey based on hypothetical scenarios, treating thoughts as if they were facts. And, again, all of this happens without conscious intention. There's something paradoxical about this process. The same brain that creates fear also offers relief when you avoid what it has identified as a threat. This relief reinforces the behavior. The mind learns that fleeing works, even when there was no danger at all. Over time, fear becomes a silent guide, influencing choices and shaping mindset without being questioned. When you start to observe this, you realize that many recurring worries follow the same pattern. They don't resolve themselves because they didn't stem from real problems, but from projections. The brain creates a story, the body reacts, and reason then kicks in trying to justify why that reaction made sense. The threat was never confirmed, but the emotional impact has already happened. This awareness doesn't eliminate fear, but it changes your relationship with it. Instead of accepting every warning as absolute truth, space opens up for curiosity. A pause between thought and reaction. A moment to realize that the brain is trying to protect you, even when it exaggerates. This small distancing can transform how you deal with anxiety, difficult decisions, and situations that previously seemed unbearable. And the more you observe, the clearer it becomes that fear rarely speaks about the present. It almost always speaks about past experiences, reconstructed memories, and future expectations. It doesn't describe what is happening now, but what could happen if something got out of control. This difference is subtle but fundamental. Recognizing it changes the way you interpret your own thoughts. As this understanding deepens, other questions begin to arise. If the brain exaggerates threats to protect you, what happens when this mechanism mixes with identity, self-esteem, and sense of personal worth? What other stories does it create to keep everything functioning, even if it distorts reality? These revelations don't appear all at once. They unfold slowly as you begin to observe your own mind more attentively. If this passage reflected something you felt in your daily life, comment by writing, "I'm on this journey too." When all these pieces begin to connect, an almost inevitable question arises. Why does the brain do all this? Why create distortions, shortcuts, incomplete stories, and altered versions of reality? The answer lies not in failure, defect, or sabotage. It lies in survival. The brain lies because this was one of the most efficient strategies that evolution found to keep the species alive in uncertain, dangerous, and unpredictable environments. These lies did not arise to confuse but to protect. From a scientific point of view, the brain is a system shaped by millions of years of natural selection. It wasn't designed to seek existential clarity, absolute truth, or philosophical coherence. It was shaped to react quickly, conserve energy, and ensure continuity. In an ancestral scenario, overthinking could cost a life. Questioning every perception, every fear, or every impulse would be too slow. So the brain learned to decide before fully understanding. And, when necessary, to justify afterward. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this shift in perception changes everything. When you understand that these lies are part of an adaptive mechanism, something important happens. The relationship with your own mind transforms. Instead of seeing the brain as a traitor, you begin to see it as an imperfect guardian. A guardian that acts based on ancient maps, created for a world very different from the current one. These distortions accelerate decisions. The brain simplifies complex scenarios to allow for immediate action. It creates quick labels, dividing the world into safe and dangerous, familiar and strange. This simplification reduces cognitive overload and allows you to function even under pressure. The cost of this is the loss of nuance. The truth is compressed to fit into quick responses. But, from a survival standpoint, this has always been an acceptable price. Furthermore, the brain lies to protect the ego. Human identity is fragile. Confronting mistakes, internal contradictions, or profound flaws generates intense psychological suffering. To avoid this internal collapse, the brain adjusts narratives, softens memories, and creates justifications that preserve self-esteem. This is not conscious vanity. It is a mechanism of emotional self-regulation. Maintaining a minimally stable self-image is fundamental to moving forward. These lies also reduce suffering. Reliving the past with absolute precision would be emotionally unbearable in many cases. The brain alters memories, blurs details, and rearranges events so that the pain is tolerable. It doesn't erase what happened, but it changes how it impacts the present. This process allows for adaptation, continuity, and even growth. Without it, the mind could remain permanently trapped in traumatic experiences. There is also a need for control. The brain creates explanations because the feeling of not understanding is deeply uncomfortable. The lack of explanation generates anxiety. so it prefers an imperfect answer to no answer at all. Even when it doesn't know exactly what happened, it creates a plausible story. This narrative restores the feeling of predictability, even if based on assumptions. The hidden truth here is that feeling in control is more important to the brain than being right. When you look at all of this together, you realize that these lies follow a coherent logic. They don't arise randomly. They appear whenever there is a threat to internal stability. Major changes, prolonged uncertainties, difficult decisions, emotional losses. In all these moments, the brain activates its protective mechanisms. It distorts, filters, simplifies, and reorganizes reality to keep you functional. The impact of this understanding is profound. It changes how you interpret your own thoughts. Instead of fighting every fear, every doubt, or every internal narrative, space emerges to observe. To ask, what is my brain trying to protect right now? This question doesn't invalidate the feeling, but reveals its function. And understanding the function diminishes the automatic power that these stories exert. This change in mindset doesn't eliminate old mechanisms, but it creates a more conscious relationship with them. You begin to notice when a reaction is the result of an old pattern being applied to new territory. When a decision stems more from fear than from present reality. When an internal narrative serves more to maintain comfort than to reflect what is really happening. The brain is not your enemy. It's a brilliant yet limited system operating with strategies that have worked for a long time. The problem arises when these strategies aren't updated. When the world changes faster than mental filters. At that point, the lies that once protected you begin to restrict you. Recognizing this is an important step in any journey of personal transformation. And the more you observe these behind-the-scenes aspects, the clearer it becomes that there is a subtle yet powerful difference between protection and imprisonment. The same mechanism that kept you alive can, in certain contexts, keep you small. This line is not obvious. It reveals itself gradually as you begin to pay attention to the patterns, repetitions, and stories that automatically emerge within your mind. This perception opens the door to something even more delicate. If the brain lies to protect, accelerate, and maintain control, what happens when you begin to question these lies with curiosity instead of resistance? What changes when you learn to recognize the guardian without blindly obeying it? This question doesn't seek an immediate answer. It prepares the ground for something deeper, which begins to emerge as awareness expands and observation becomes more refined. If this passage made sense to you, comment by writing, "This makes sense to me." When all of this falls into place, when perception, memory, emotion, fear, and survival begin to form a single pattern, an inner silence arises that is difficult to ignore. A silence that doesn't demand immediate answers, but provokes a question that resonates deeply. Because if the brain interprets the world, rewrites the past, creates stories for emotions, and exaggerates threats to protect you, then something essential needs to be faced honestly. If your brain lies to you every day, who is really in control of your life? This question is neither simple nor comfortable. It challenges your idea of autonomy, identity, and free will. The common feeling is that you decide, choose, evaluate, and guide your own journey. But, when you look closer, you realize that many of these decisions were born before consciousness. They emerged behind the scenes, shaped by invisible filters, ancient maps, and protective strategies that the brain built long before you realized it. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this isn't about taking power away from you, but about revealing where it's truly being exercised. The brain takes control when it identifies risk, discomfort, or uncertainty. It makes quick decisions to preserve stability, even if this limits possibilities. It prefers to keep you safe within known patterns rather than allow a transformation that requires facing the unknown. And, in doing so, it creates the feeling that there was no other choice. How many important life decisions were made under this silent logic? Changes postponed because they seemed too dangerous. Paths abandoned because they triggered fear. Relationships maintained because they offered familiarity, not because they made sense. The brain presented these choices as prudence, responsibility, or maturity. But often they were just coping strategies. Ways to avoid the discomfort that accompanies any real rupture. Control rarely appears as imposition. It disguises itself as common sense. The brain doesn't say, "Don't do it." It says, "Maybe it's not the right time, this could go wrong, better wait a little longer." These phrases seem rational, balanced, careful. And that's exactly why they are so effective. They keep everything in minimal motion without requiring direct confrontation with the truth hidden behind inertia. There is a subtle difference between choosing and reacting. Choosing involves awareness of fear, emotion, and narrative. Reacting happens when these forces act alone. The brain prefers reaction because it is quick and predictable. Choice requires pause, observation, and energy. In a fast-paced world, reaction seems more practical. But, over time, it exacts a silent price, the feeling of living on autopilot. This realization doesn't appear all at once. It emerges in small moments of lucidity. When you ask yourself why you repeated the same pattern again. When you realize you justified something that, deep down, you knew didn't make sense. When you feel you're defending a decision more to protect an internal image than because you believe in it. These moments are invitations. Not to blame the brain but to engage in dialogue with it. The brain won't stop trying to control. That's its role. But there's a difference between being blindly guided and walking consciously. When you recognize the mechanisms, you gain internal space. A gap between impulse and action. A space where mindset can transform, where decisions are observed before being executed, where internal narratives cease to be absolute truths and become merely possible versions. The impact of this is profound because it changes the relationship you have with your own thoughts. They cease to be orders and become signals. Emotions cease to be enemies and become information. Fears cease to be prophecies and become alerts that can be evaluated. At this point, control doesn't disappear, it's redistributed. It's not entirely in the hands of the automatic brain, nor entirely in conscious reason, but in a more attentive balance. This journey has no clear finish line. There is no moment when you take full control. What exists is a continuous process of observation, adjustment, and conscious choice. Every time you notice an automatic narrative and decide to investigate it, something changes. Every time you recognize an exaggerated fear and don't react immediately, a new space opens up. Small, almost imperceptible, but real. And it is precisely in this space that something begins to reorganize itself. The way you see yourself, how you interpret challenges, and how you respond to the world. The brain continues doing what it always has, but you begin to see what's behind the scenes. And seeing what's behind the scenes changes everything. Because when consciousness expands, the stories lose some of their automatic force. They don't disappear, but they cease to control everything on their own. This question lingers not as an accusation but as an invitation. If the brain lies to protect, accelerate, and maintain control, what happens when you learn to listen to it without automatically obeying? What changes when observation becomes part of your way of being? This answer doesn't come in ready-made words. It reveals itself gradually, in the way you react, choose, and position yourself in relation to your own mind. If this thought has been resonating with you, comment by writing, "I'm on this journey too." Bottom of the form. If you've made it this far, it's because this content in some way resonated with you. And that says a lot. This channel exists precisely for this kind of exchange, to explore ideas that make us stop, think, and see our own minds from a different angle. If this video brought you value, if it helped you understand a little better the inner workings of the brain and its impact on your decisions and your journey, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue exploring these topics with me at your own pace without rushing. If you'd like, leave a comment saying you stayed until the end. You can write something like, "This message was for me," or, "I'm with you until the end." I truly read them, and it helps keep this space alive, human, and connected with people who like to delve a little deeper. And if at any point during the video you felt that sense of identification, that inner silence that makes sense, leave a like. It's just a simple gesture, but it shows that this connection happened and helps this type of content continue to reach more people who are also on this journey. There's a video over here that complements this topic and delves even deeper into these reflections on the human mind and behavior. Click on it and continue reading there.